Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about learning, which is one of the foundation topics in all of psychology. First, we're going to define learning, and then we're going to talk about the three main ways in which we learn. We'll give some examples, and then we'll summarize everything that we talked about. So, learning is defined as a relatively permanent change in behavior based on experience. And the one reason why we talk about learning as a change in behavior is because seeing the change in behavior makes learning more objectively measurable, meaning that I don't know if you truly learned something unless I see a change in behavior. I'll give you a very silly example, but let's say you were looking at a stovetop and a child walks over to the stovetop. That child sees the stovetop is glowing red, meaning that it's hot. If they touch it, just out of curiosity, and they get hurt, when they walk over to the stove and they're afraid to touch it, their behavior changed, which means I know that the child learned something. If I take that same child and they walk over and touch the stovetop and get hurt, and I ask them, do you know that you shouldn't touch the stovetop? If they say, yes, I know, and yet they go back to the stovetop a few minutes later and then touch it again, well, even though they said that they learned it, and they might have, I know that they didn't, or I can't objectively say that they didn't. So, we're going to talk about learning, and learning really happens in three major ways. Associative learning, or learning through association, which is also learning through pairing, putting two different things together and relating these things with one another, and we'll talk about this in more detail as we go through, also known as classical conditioning. We learn through consequences, meaning that if you engage in a behavior and something favorable happens, you'll probably do it again, or if you engage in a behavior and something unfavorable happens, you probably won't do it again. We call that operant conditioning, or consequence-based learning. And finally, we learn through modeling, observation, watching others do things. We can also call this social learning. And we'll talk about that one last. Then we'll talk about the concept of learned helplessness, and that will round out our topic. So we're going to start by talking about associative learning, or pairing, or classical conditioning. With classical conditioning, this is the process of taking two things that really have no relationship with each other. And when I say things, I'm referring to stimuli. Two stimuli that have no relationship with each other. And pairing these things together through different ways, usually repeated presentations of each other, to make a connection. Pairing these things so that the person experiencing the pairing connects these two things together in a way where they basically end up meaning the same thing. The original experiment on classical conditioning was done by a Russian physiologist named Ivan Pavlov. Pavlov was originally studying digestion in dogs, and he wanted to see or measure the digestive process. And the first thing in the digestive process that happens is typically salivation, right? The mouth gets ready for food, it releases saliva. So what Pavlov was doing was he was measuring the salivary response in dogs, and he would present food to dogs and then measure their saliva. One thing that he noticed when he was studying the dogs was that eventually, after studying the dogs again and again, what he would initially do is present food to the dog, and the dog would drool. But what he realized after a while was the dog would start to drool before he presented the food to them, which he found kind of fascinating. And what he realized was that something was triggering the dog to drool. They learned that food was coming, and this trigger, whatever it was basically eliciting the drooling response, which is an automatic response, right? You don't choose to drool. Drooling happens automatically. So first, let's talk about a stimulus, and let's talk about a response. A stimulus is something that activates a sense organ, right? So anything that activates one of the sensory organs. If I show you a picture, the picture's a stimulus. Any smell, taste, sound, these are all things that activate sense organs. So in this case, one of the stimuli was the food. It triggered the activation of the sense organ. It triggered the sense of smell. When you ate it, it triggered the taste response, etc. But a stimuli is anything that triggers a response, right? A response is the behavior that you engage in response to the stimulus. So in this case, the stimulus was the food, and the response was the increased salivary production, the drooling. Stimulus response. Okay? Now, another vocabulary word that's important in this that we'll kind of put down there and remember for a little bit later is something called conditioning. Conditioning means training. That's really all that it means, right? If you go to a gym and you engage in physical conditioning, you're engaging in training. Conditioning means training. If something is conditioned, it's been trained. Okay, if something is unconditioned, it means it's not trained. No training took place. It doesn't mean that it doesn't cause a response. So if a stimulus is unconditioned, it causes a response, but the response happens automatically without training. And it's important to understand this if we're going to go forward and understand classical conditioning. Okay, so here's what happened with Pavlov's experiment. Pavlov realized that something was triggering the dog's response. And it was something that was triggering the response even before they got the food. So he did some experiments and tried to figure out if he could trigger the dog's response, the salivary response, by pairing the food with something else. So he would pair the food with different stimuli. He would pair it with a bell, so he would ring a bell and then present the food and then see if the dog would drool. He would do that again and again to see if eventually the dog would drool by being presented with the bell. And then he would try a whole bunch of different stimuli. He would try to pair lights with the food, try to pair, I said bell already with the food, but try to pair metronomes with the food, which is a device that tells time when you're playing a piano. And what he realized is that almost any stimulus, anything that may or may not have had meaning to the dog, if it was presented just before the food, eventually that pairing, that association would happen, where the dog would associate that stimulus with the food, and then that stimulus would elicit drooling even if you didn't present them with the food. If you copy and paste the link on the bottom of this page into a browser, you'll see a brief video made by Philip Zimbardo, a very famous social psychologist, about the Pavlov experiments. The video is obviously quite old, but it's still a very good explanation of the process that goes kind of beyond what I said here. So take a second, watch the video, and then come back and we'll continue the discussion. Okay, so we're back. So the way that classical conditioning worked, normally, if you look at this image, Pavlov would present the food, which we call the unconditioned stimulus, because there was no training that needed to happen for the dog to drool. He would present the food, and the dog would drool. Now, the stimulus in this case is the food, the response is the drooling. We call the food the unconditioned stimulus because no training has to take place, and we call the drooling the unconditioned response because, again, no training had to take place for this to come out. We abbreviate unconditioned stimulus as UCS, and we abbreviate unconditioned response as UCR, and we'll be referring to them as such going forward. Now, originally, when the bell was presented, there was no response. So the bell was a stimulus that wasn't trained but didn't elicit a response in the beginning. So we called it a neutral stimulus. And when we rang the bell, no salivation happened. So there was no conditioned response because the bell wouldn't normally elicit salivation. It'll only elicit salivation once it's been conditioned or trained. But if we would ring the bell and then present the food just after, the dog would drool. Originally, the dog would drool in response to the food. But if you added the bell and the food, bell, food, again and again and again, one right after the other, bell first, then food, eventually over time, all you would have to do is ring the bell, and then it would elicit the same response that food would elicit. Okay? So once the bell has been paired with the food, the bell then becomes the conditioned stimulus, and the drooling in response to the bell, and this is important, the drooling in response to the bell becomes the conditioned response. The drooling in response to the food is the unconditioned response, and the drooling in response to the bell is the conditioned response, abbreviated CR. And by default, the drooling in response, the bell itself, excuse me, is abbreviated the CS, the conditioned stimulus. Okay? So, quick vocabulary review. The unconditioned stimulus is the thing that we naturally respond to. No training has taken place. The unconditioned response is the thing that we respond to naturally or normally, and that, in this case, in Pavlov's case, was the food. Sorry, was the salivating in response to the food. Excuse me. Unconditioned stimulus is the food. The unconditioned response is the salivating to the food. The conditioned stimulus is the, in this case, bell, but it could be anything. It could be a light. It could be a metronome. It could be clapping of your hands. It could be anything. And the conditioned response, the learned response, is the salivating in response to, in this case, the bell. But it could be lights, it could be clapping, or whatever it is. And it's important to understand what the response is responding to, because you have to delineate the two. If you're referring to the response to the food, it's the unconditioned response. If you're referring to the response to the bell, it's the conditioned response. And we have to delineate between the two, because in order to understand if it's the natural occurring stimulus that you're responding to versus the trained or conditioned stimulus, you need to delineate which one you're responding to, and you need to delineate what type of response is it. Is it unconditioned or conditioned? Okay, given that, you can take a look down here. There are a few examples, and I'll go through this first one here, and then you can kind of go through the others on your own. But there are a few examples of conditioning and how conditioning occurs, or what it occurs to. So, we're classically conditioned to feel anxious in response to music in horror movies. This is because we associate music with the killer in the horror movies. So, UCS is unconditioned stimulus, CS is conditioned stimulus, UCR is unconditioned response, CR is conditioned response. So, figure out the stimulus and figure out the response. In this case, there are two stimuli. Stimuli 1 is music in the horror movies. Stimuli 2 is the killer. So, the unconditioned stimulus, the thing we're naturally afraid of, is the killer. Okay? The unconditioned response, in this case, is fear of the killer. Okay? The conditioned stimulus, the thing that we pair with the killer, is music, and the conditioned response is fear of the music. Okay? Alright, there are a bunch of others here, so take a look at the others, go through them, and see if you can figure it out. The conditioned response is always going to be a similar response, but the conditioned and unconditioned responses are always going to be similar. But the big thing is, what are you responding to? That makes the difference of whether or not it's the conditioned or the unconditioned response. The unconditioned response always responds to the natural or unconditioned stimulus. The conditioned response always responds to the conditioned stimulus. Okay? All right, so take a look at these, go through them, and see if you can sort of figure these out. Okay, so a couple of key points to classical conditioning, and then a couple of other concepts related to that, and then we'll move on to operant conditioning. So, acquisition is the process where the individual is connecting or acquiring the association between the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, right? So that's how we make classical conditioning happen. It's extremely important in the order of presentation. So using the Pavlov example, what ends up happening is that you have to present the bell and then the meat, or there's actually meat powder done originally, but you have to present the bell first and then the meat in order for the understanding that the bell is eliciting the meat to occur. If you present meat first and then the bell, well, then the individual would have no understanding that the bell relates to the meat, right? Or the individual might understand that the bell means full. It won't elicit the response to the meat, or elicit the response to after the meat's been presented. Timing's important too. The bell, in this case, needs to be presented just before the food. And the reason why is if it's too delayed, the person or the animal or whatever it is will never make a connection between the bell and the meat, right? So it has to be just before. And then we say accuracy, meaning it has to be done consistently. It has to happen every single time. Because if it happens every time, the connection will be made more easily and more quickly. If it happens inconsistently, the connection might not be made at all, or might take longer for it to make, especially if it's very inconsistent. All right. Couple of other concepts, couple of other things. Extinction. Extinction is the process of a decrease in conditioned response after repeated presentations of the conditioned stimulus without presentations of the unconditioned stimulus. In layman's terms, if I kept ringing the bell, the unconditioned stimulus, and never presented food, eventually the drooling would stop. The dog would learn that there's no food coming and the bell doesn't mean anything. Okay? And that process of decreasing the drooling is called extinction. Now, the opposite can happen. Once extinction occurs, the individual can have a rebound effect, where if presented with the stimulus again, they might start drooling again. So again, same example, ringing the bell, and we go through extinction. Bell, no food, drool, bell, no food, drool, eventually bell, no drooling. Give the dog a break, give the person a break, whatever it is. You ring the bell, and all of a sudden, a couple of weeks, a couple months later, they might start drooling. And we call this spontaneous recovery. It's just a process that happens because the learning is sort of reawakened in the individual. It was sort of laying dormant. It was decreased, but it's still there. We call learning a relatively permanent change. So it's still there, but it lay dormant and got reactivated. Okay, two other things with classical conditioning, and then we're going to get to operant conditioning. Stimulus generalization and stimulus discrimination. One thing that can happen once you're classically conditioned, or once classical conditioning occurs, is that the conditioned response might be elicited by multiple stimuli. So there's a very famous experiment called the Little Albert experiment that was done where they classically conditioned little Albert to be afraid of a white rat by pairing cymbal crashing with the presentation of a white rat. The white rat was presented first, then cymbals would crash. The white rat was a neutral stimulus, cymbal crashing was an unconditioned stimulus, and then it elicited a fear response. The problem is that once the conditioning occurred, little Albert became afraid of anything that was similar to the white rat, like little white bunnies, or big white beards, or cotton, anything that was white and fluffy. So he generalized his response to the stimulus, or generalized the stimuli that elicited the response. He didn't do this on purpose, it just happened automatically. And so he was responding to multiple stimuli that were similar to each other. So we call this stimulus generalization. Stimulus discrimination is the opposite. Stimulus discrimination is the process in which the individual responds, or only responds to limited numbers of stimuli. So they had to retrain little Albert, because now he was terrified of all of these different stimuli that were similar, and they had to retrain him. And so they went through the process of extinction. And over time, little Albert did not respond in fear to beards, or rabbits, or cotton balls, or anything else. He only responded to rats. He's not terrified of rats anymore, but he doesn't like them. And he's still around, from what I understand. So that's stimulus discrimination, where the individual responds to certain stimuli in one way and not another, right? Treats them differently, okay, for lack of a better term. All right, so that is classical conditioning in a nutshell. Now we're going to move on to operant conditioning, okay? Operant conditioning is based on, we call it voluntary learning, or it's learning through consequences. And it's based in Thorndike's law of effect. And basically, what Thorndike's law of effect says is that behavior that is met with favorable consequences is more likely to be repeated. Meaning, if you do something and something you like happens, or something good happens, typically, I don't want to say good or bad, okay? But if something that you prefer happens, then you'll probably do it again. If you do something and something that you don't prefer happens or don't like, you probably won't do it again. Okay, so forget that I said good, because that was a mistake. So you do something and something favorable happens, typically, theoretically. You'll do it again. You do something unfavorable happens, and you probably won't do it again. Okay? And that's basically operant conditioning in a nutshell. Okay? So, a couple of different concepts in operant conditioning. One is reinforcement. Reinforcement is the process of making a behavior more likely. So anything that makes a behavior more likely is a reinforcer. Anything that makes a behavior less likely or decreases the frequency of a behavior is a punishment. We'll get to that in a second. Reinforcers are the actual things given or taken away that make behaviors more likely, and reinforcement is the process of making something more likely. So let's say, a child does their homework, and you want to reinforce their homework. You might give them something they like. So you might give them ice cream. Ice cream is the reinforcer, the thing that you give them to increase the behavior. Reinforcement is the process of giving them something that they like, or taking something that they don't like away. I'll get to that in a second. Okay, so positive and negative. Positive doesn't mean good, and negative doesn't mean bad, which is why in the video earlier I said, forget that I said good or bad, because that's a mistake. In the sciences, positive means adding, negative means taking away. Okay? The way I remember this is think about a blood test. You're positive for high cholesterol. Is that a good thing? No, it just means adding. It's present. You're positive for diabetes. It's not a good thing. It just means adding, or that it's pleasant. Negative means taking away. You're negative for high blood pressure, negative for diabetes. It's not bad. It just means that it's not there, the lack of. Okay? So, if we're talking about reinforcement or making a behavior more likely, you can either engage in positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement. Positive reinforcement would be giving or adding something that would make a behavior more likely. And negative reinforcement would be taking away or subtracting something to make a behavior more likely. Reinforcement is always about making something more likely. Okay? So, for example, I gave you the example of the ice cream. So the child does their homework, you give them ice cream, and then they're more likely to do the homework again in the future. Positive reinforcement. Negative reinforcement would be taking something away to make their behavior more likely. So, for example, let's say the child has chores to do, and they don't like doing the chores. So you say, well, you did all of your homework, and you did it right. So now tonight, I'm going to say that you do not have to do your chores. I'll do them for you. That is negative reinforcement. I'm taking something away. I'm taking the chores away to make it more likely. So I have to take something, or theoretically I'm taking something unpleasant away, right? People make the mistake, take their PlayStation away or take their Xbox away. Well, if you do your homework and I take your Xbox away for doing your homework, are you going to do your homework again? No, so that wouldn't be reinforcement. Okay, because it's not making the behavior more likely. All right? Now, there are two types of reinforcers. Primary reinforcers and secondary reinforcers. Primary reinforcers are reinforcers that satisfy a basic or biological need. This could be food, safety, shelter, things like that. Secondary reinforcers are typically things that get us more primary. So money, power, status, esteem, a title, all these kinds of things are secondary reinforcers, right? Think about a baby. Baby responds to all primary reinforcers. If you offer a baby, a bottle of milk or $1, which would they respond to? The bottle of milk, primary. If you offer an adult a bottle of milk, or let's say $5, which would the adult respond to? Probably more so the $5. It's a secondary reinforcer. You have to learn to want the $5. Okay? All right. The opposite of reinforcement is punishment. Okay? Punishment reduces the likelihood of a behavior reoccurring. Reinforcement increases, punishment decreases. Okay? Don't think about punishment as, getting a timeout or getting in trouble or getting spanked or anything like that. These are examples of types of punishment. But punishment in general means the act of decreasing the likelihood of a behavior reoccurring. Period. Now, one thing to understand about reinforcement and punishment is that some of the things that we think are reinforcements aren't actually reinforcements, and some of the things that we think of as punishments aren't actually punishments. It really is a function of whether or not the preceding behavior increases or decreases. Okay? Silly example, but friends of mine had a child, and they basically didn't spend as much time with the child as they could. They set the child up with video games, toys, everything else in a separate part of the house, and they would leave the child alone to play. And eventually the child would get frustrated and start throwing toys and breaking things, and the parents would come over and then give the child a timeout or scold the child or whatever. And then the more that they scolded the child, the more the child would break things. And the parents just didn't understand what was happening. They thought that they were punishing him. They thought that they were adding something unpleasant, the scolding or taking something away, right? The ability of freedom, the ability to do what he wanted with timeouts. They thought that they were adding some type of punishment. But the behavior was increasing. What I had to explain to them was that they were actually reinforcing the behavior. The screaming at him, the timeouts, was a form of attention. Even though it wasn't attention that he would prefer, it was a form of attention. And so they were, in essence, reinforcing the attention, reinforcing the tantruming, reinforcing the screaming, reinforcing the breaking things. And they didn't realize it. It wasn't meant to be a reinforcement, but it was a reinforcement because it was increasing the behavior. Okay? So hopefully that makes sense. All right. Now, just like with reinforcement, you can add something to increase a behavior or take something away to increase a behavior. Punishment's the same way. You can engage in punishment by application or positive punishment, two different names for the same thing, or punishment by removal or negative punishment, two different names for the same thing. Adding something to make a behavior less likely, or taking something away to make a behavior less likely. So, punishment by application. Okay, so child comes home, I ask how the day was, they scream at me, you're a terrible person, I hate you, I don't love you. And if hypothetically I slapped the child in the mouth, which I wouldn't do, but hypothetically I did, that is punishment by application. I'm applying the slap. I'm applying pain to reduce the behavior. Again, wouldn't do that, but it's just an example. Punishment by removal is taking something away. Same example, child comes in the house, I hate you, terrible person, blah, blah, blah. And then I say, okay, well now you can't play your Xbox. I took away something to make the behavior less likely. That's punishment by removal. Excuse me. Okay. There are these examples here to kind of understand or help you understand or figure out positive reinforcement, punishment by application, punishment by removal, negative reinforcement. And again, I don't love when you say something good, so we'll sort of change this to something favorable, right? Just to kind of make it make a little bit more sense. And then here, something unfavorable. Okay? And hopefully I spell that right. And again, it really is about, being favorable to the individual, kind of being subjective, etc. It's got to be something that the individual prefers. Okay? Otherwise, it doesn't work. Okay? All right. Now, there are a couple of examples here where you can figure out if it's positive or negative reinforcement. I'll go through the first one. A child is given candy for finishing his homework. Positive reinforcement, because I'm adding something favorable. Okay? Now, there are a few examples here that you can try on your own. Punishment by application or removal. So, after running into the street, a child receives a spanking. Punishment by application. I'm applying the spanking. Okay? One that's very hard is this one here. This one here. So that one, after exceeding my minutes, I am charged an extra $15 by the phone company. That is actually punishment by removal or negative punishment, because I'm taking money out of the individual's bank account. So I'm removing something. Okay? That is punishment by removal. Another example of negative punishment or punishment by application that's similar is to this example, after exceeding the minutes example, is something like a speeding ticket. Is that punishment by application or punishment by removal? It's punishment by removal. They're not applying a ticket, okay? The ticket represents a debit. The ticket represents a deduction from your bank account. So that's punishment by removal because you're taking something away, okay? So you're taking money away from the individual, okay? So these are a little bit confusing. It's good that you're kind of thinking this process through, but remember, if it results in a reduction of something, then it's removal. Okay, you're not adding the ticket, you're adding the fine. The fine is a debit from your account. Okay, again, it's a little confusing, but I want to make sure you have the concepts down. Now, there's something called schedules of reinforcement, right? So we talked about, a behavior and a consequence, right? A reinforcement or a punishment. But sometimes behaviors repeat. Frequently behaviors repeat. And so we would repeatedly reinforce those behaviors. We could reinforce those behaviors in different ways. Okay? We could either reinforce those behaviors through when the behavior is completed, or we can reinforce those behaviors based on how long those behaviors are happening. When we repeatedly reinforce a behavior, we call that a reinforcement schedule. Okay? Now, there are a few different schedules of reinforcement. Okay? When we reinforce a schedule consistently, we call that a fixed reinforcement schedule. Okay? But it just means consistent. It could be every time the behavior occurs. It could be if the behavior lasts for an hour, every hour that it lasts for, or every time you complete the behavior, or every 2 times you complete the behavior, or every 3 times you complete the behavior. We call that fixed. When we reinforce the behavior in unpredictable ways or random ways, we call that variable. Okay, so fixed versus variable. Now, there are certain behaviors that lend themselves to reinforcements based on how long you've been doing it or time, and there are certain behaviors that lend themselves to reinforcement based on the number of occurrences or if it's been completed or not. So for time, one behavior that might be more apt to reinforce for time is, let's say, studying. How long you've been studying. So for every hour you study, I give you a cookie. You study for an hour, you get a cookie. Hour cookie, right? That would be an interval-based reinforcement schedule. That would be based on time, how long you've been doing it. Okay? I can't really reinforce studying based on number of occurrences. Did you study or not, right? So what's one study? What's 2 studies? Do I give you 2 cookies for 2 studies? What does it mean? If you study for 1 second or 1 minute, which is 1 study, right? So I reinforce you based on how long you've been doing it. A ratio-based reinforcement schedule is when we reinforce something based on the number of occurrences. So, let's say you worked on commission. Every time you make a sale, you get a commission. That's a ratio-based. 1 sale, 1 commission. If you're selling things that are small items or inexpensive items, I might reinforce you after every 3 sales, right? It's still a ratio-based. 3 sales, 1 commission. 3 sales, 1 commission. It's still ratio-based. Okay? Now, we can combine all 4 of the above to make different schedules of reinforcement. We can have fixed ratio, fixed interval, variable ratio, or variable interval. Okay? A fixed ratio, we'll do that one first, is a reinforcement schedule where you reinforce a behavior based on a set number of occurrences. So again, the example I used was commissions. So let's say you're selling subscriptions to a magazine. Every subscription, you get a commission. 1-to-1 ratio. And because it goes 1-to-1, it's fixed. If I do it every 3 subscriptions sold, you get a commission. That's still fixed, right? 3-to-1, 3-to-1, 3-to-1. If it's every time it's 3, you get a reinforcement. It's a fixed ratio because it's still a consistent ratio. A variable ratio might be a reinforcement schedule where it's inconsistent, unpredictable, unreliable. So an example of a variable ratio reinforcement schedule might be something like a commission based on selling houses. Okay? You never know what you're going to get. You never know what the house is going to sell for. Sometimes you sell a house and you might make $5,000 commission. Sometimes you sell a house and you might make a $50,000 commission. And since you can never predict the price of the sale, you never know what the commission is going to be. So you never know what the reinforcement's going to be. It is random. It's variable. But it's based on the sale. It's not based on time. It's based on the completion of the sale. You can spend 5 months selling a house, or you can sell a house in 5 minutes. It is random. Okay? And it's based on time. It's based on the completion of the sale. Time is not a factor. Okay? So it is variable ratio. Interval. So we'll do fixed interval. If you get a paycheck every 2 weeks and it's the same paycheck, it's fixed interval. If you get paid the same every hour for an hourly wage job, it's fixed interval. Okay? Every month, every week, every hour, it's fixed interval. Variable interval would be something where you make money or get some type of reinforcement, doesn't have to be money, based on a changing amount of time, an amount of time that you're not necessarily aware of, or that it's not consistent. So an example is something like the stock market. So if you buy a stock and hold it, the stock might go up in a week 1%, it might go up 5%, it might go down. Okay? It's random. It's random the amount of time that you're going to have to hold it for it to go up. It might take a month, a year, 10 years. You don't know. But it's based on time, how long you hold that stock, right? If you could buy a stock and sell it with no time passing, the value of the stock doesn't change. But if you buy a stock and hold it, there's no telling what the reinforcement is going to be based on how long you've been holding it. It's unpredictable, so it's variable. And because it varies based on time, we call it a variable interval reinforcement schedule. Okay? So, just examples, definitions, fixed ratio, variable ratio, and here are the definitions: fixed interval, variable interval. Okay? All right. You can have some examples of this to go through it. A teacher gives a pop quiz on a few random days during the semester. It is variable interval, because time, different days during the semester. And because it's random, it's variable. I'll give you one more example here. I'll do one more for you. You can do the others on your own. A slot machine sometimes pays after $10, $20, or $100. That is variable ratio. You never know how many times you have to pull the handle on the slot machine or press the button on the slot machine to get a payout. It's unpredictable, it's random, it's variable, and it's ratio because it's a function of completed behaviors. How many behaviors did you complete? 2, 3, 5, 20 to get the payoff. It is a ratio basis. Okay. Two other concepts that we're going to talk about here: observational learning and learned helplessness, and then we're done. Observational learning, also known as modeling, is where somebody repeats, copies, or learns behaviors that they observe. Okay? Modeling is a demonstration of behaviors, desirable or undesirable, and imitation is a replication. So observational learning is a function of imitational learning. You can watch this video here. There is a link below, and I highly recommend you watch it. And it's based on one of the most famous studies in psychology, and it's what we call the Pavlov doll study. It's a study of observational learning, where children witnessed models playing with a Bobo doll, which was an inflatable doll that had a picture of a clown in it. And based on how the person that they watched interacted with the doll, children would typically imitate or replicate those behaviors. Okay? And the video explains it a little further than that, but it was one of the more famous studies in psychology. The interesting thing was they ran this in a number of different ways. So they had, male children watching a female model, they had male children watching a male model, female children watching a female model, female children watching a male model, and different permutations of such. One thing that they found was that the more that the learner identified with or felt like they connected with or resembled the teacher, the more likely the learner was to model the behavior. Okay? So the more they connected or felt similar, felt like they were like in many ways to the model, the more likely they are to learn it or imitate the behavior. If you ever see children on a playground, you can see very clear examples of this, right? the little children follow the other children that are close to them in age. So if you have a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old playing together, the 3-year-old is going to follow that 5-year-old. Much, much more than the 3-year-old would follow after a 25-year-old. Why? Because they identify more with the 5-year-old than with the 25-year-old. Okay? Same thing in all walks of life, right? If somebody's telling you this inspirational story about how they overcame adversity or how they became a success running a company, if you could relate to that person, it's more likely that you can emulate their process. But if you find them totally unrelatable or nothing like you, it's less likely that you'll emulate them, or at least this is what the research indicates. Okay. Last thing, concept of learned helplessness. Seligman did this very famous experiment on dogs to demonstrate a process that he theorized would come to fruition. And it's the process that he called learned helplessness. He believed that through his research on depression and even Holocaust survivors, that under the right circumstances, or under specific circumstances, I should say, people learn to give up. Okay? So, and the reason that they learn to give up is because they learn that they're helpless against the whatever discomfort they're experiencing. So the way that he did it with dogs was he put dogs in a cage that had a divider in it. And the floor was able to be electrified. You could either electrify the whole floor, half of the floor, or the other half of the floor. Whatever you chose to do. Okay, so he put dogs in this cage, and the electricity wasn't dangerous, it was just uncomfortable. And the cage had a divider on the floor. And he would wait till the dogs stood up on one side, and then he would electrify the side of the floor that the dogs are standing on. The dogs would jump over the divider, and they would land on the other side that's not electrified. After a couple of seconds, he'd electrify the side that they were standing on, and then they would jump back to the first side, and they'd go back and forth again and again. And the dogs would continue to jump, as long as they could escape from the electricity. Then what he did was, he pulled the divider out and electrified the whole floor. Shortly after, the dog would jump up and down and then realize that it couldn't escape from the discomfort. And then something interesting happened. The dog would lay down, okay, and just take the shock. What Seligman hypothesized, or theorized, or concluded, I guess, from his research, was that the dogs learned that they were helpless to avoid the shock, so they just accepted the shock for what it is. He would apply that to people in depression, apply that to people in the Holocaust, and basically he argued that if you believed that there was no escape from this, you would just suffer through it. So people who are depressed experience the sad mood, the feelings of depression, the rumination, and it's almost constant. It's all the time. It's always with you. It's there when you get up in the morning. It's there when you go to bed at night. It's there when you eat, when you go to the bathroom. It's there all the time. And so basically he was saying that one of the reasons why people who are depressed suffer from sort of amotivation and they kind of give up and just accept it rather than fighting it is because they learn that they're helpless to fight these feelings, these sad feelings, these overwhelming feelings. Okay, so that's why they kind of just give up and take it. And that's sort of his process of learned helplessness. Okay? All right, that does it for the learning chapter. Hopefully that made sense. Feel free to watch the video again, take a look at the PowerPoint slides, etc. Okay? All right.